Hi, I'm Zara. 3 months ago, my brother Dylan stood in my childhood bedroom doorway and watched me cry over my dead laptop screen. "Guess you should have backed up your work," he said with that smirk I'd seen 1,000 times before. But this morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from him. Now he's begging me to save his career. Funny how karma works when you least expect it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain was drumming against the windows of our family's Beaverton home that Tuesday evening in October, and I was 3 hours away from the most important presentation of my life. My laptop screen glowed in the dim light of what used to be my teenage bedroom, now converted into a makeshift home office since I'd moved back in to save money during my graduate program at Portland State. The cursor blinked at the end of a slide titled Sustainable Urban Housing Solutions for Portland's Homeless Crisis, and I felt that familiar flutter of nervous excitement in my stomach. This wasn't just any presentation. This was my thesis defense capstone, the culmination of 2 years of research, interviews with dozens of homeless individuals, collaboration with city planners, and countless sleepless nights spent designing a comprehensive housing model that could actually work. More than that, it was my ticket out. The Portland Housing Authority had already expressed interest in my preliminary findings. Dr. Elena Vasquez had hinted that if the defense went well, there might be a research position waiting for me. Everything I'd worked toward since dropping out of my marketing job 3 years ago to pursue urban planning was riding on tomorrow morning's presentation. I saved my progress for the 4th time in 10 minutes and stretched my arms above my head. The presentation was solid. 47 slides of carefully researched data, cost projections, architectural mock-ups, and testimonials from the people I'd interviewed at various shelters and camps throughout Portland. I'd even included photographs from my visits to successful Housing First programs in Helsinki and Salt Lake City, trips I'd funded with my own savings, and a small research grant Dr. Vasquez had helped me secure. The sound of Dylan's BMW pulling into the driveway cut through the October rain. I glanced at the clock on my laptop screen, 9:23 p.m. He was home early for a change, probably because he had his own presentation tomorrow for whatever startup he was working with these days. Dylan was always working with some new company, some revolutionary app or service that was going to change everything. He had a gift for talking his way into consulting contracts and advisory positions, even though his actual experience seemed to shift depending on who was asking. I heard the front door slam, followed by the familiar rhythm of Dylan's footsteps on the hardwood stairs. Heavy, confident, taking them 2 at a time like he owned the place. Which, to be fair, he kind of did. While I'd been struggling through graduate school and living off teaching assistant stipends and the occasional freelance graphic design job, Dylan had been earning what he called serious money in tech consulting. He'd been covering most of the household expenses since Dad's hours got cut at the insurance office last year. "How's the homework going, Czar?" Dylan's voice carried that particular tone of condescension wrapped in false concern that had followed me through childhood. He appeared in my doorway, still wearing his expensive gray suit, tie loosened just enough to suggest he'd had a long day doing important things. I didn't look up from my screen. "It's not homework, Dylan. It's my thesis defense. You know, the thing I've been working on for the past 2 years?" He stepped into my room without being invited, his presence immediately making the space feel smaller. "Right, the homeless thing. How's that going? Still planning to save the world with government housing?" The dismissive way he said "the homeless thing" made my jaw tighten, but I kept typing. I'd learned years ago that engaging with Dylan's provocations only fed his need to be the center of attention. "The presentation's tomorrow at 10. Then I'll be out of your hair permanently." "Good for you." He moved closer to my desk, and I caught the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the craft beer he'd probably had with whatever client meeting he'd attended. "Mind if I take a look? I do a lot of presentations in my line of work. Might have some feedback." I should have said no. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to close the laptop and tell him to leave. But Dylan had always had this way of making his offers sound reasonable, even helpful. And there was a small part of me, the part that remembered looking up to my older brother when we were kids, that still wanted his approval. "Just a quick look," I said, angling the screen toward him. "But I'm pretty happy with how it turned out." Dylan leaned over my shoulder, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck as he scrolled through the slides. His silence stretched long enough to make me nervous. Finally, he straightened up and crossed his arms. "It's good," he said, and I felt a flash of surprised relief. "Really comprehensive. Although..." Of course there was an although. The data visualization could be stronger, and some of these cost projections seem optimistic. When you're dealing with government bureaucracy, you have to account for inefficiencies that your academic models don't factor in. I saved my work again and turned to face him. "Dylan, I've been working with actual city planners on this. I've run the numbers past 3 different municipal budget analysts. This isn't theoretical." He held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just trying to help. You know I want you to succeed, right? We're family." There was something in his tone that I couldn't quite place, something that felt less like brotherly concern and more like the voice he used when he was angling for something. But I was too tired and too focused on tomorrow's presentation to dig deeper. "I appreciate it," I said, turning back to my laptop. "But I really need to finish my final review and get some sleep." Dylan lingered for another moment, and I could feel him watching me work. Then he reached over and ruffled my hair the way he used to when we were kids, a gesture that might have seemed affectionate to anyone else but felt patronizing coming from him. "Good luck tomorrow, Czar. I know you'll do great." After he left, I spent another hour polishing my conclusion and practicing my opening remarks. The presentation was stored in 3 different locations: my laptop's hard drive, a backup USB drive, and uploaded to my cloud storage account. I'd learned to be paranoid about backups during my undergraduate years when a crashed computer had nearly cost me a semester project. At 11:45 p.m., I finally closed my laptop and plugged it in to charge overnight. Tomorrow morning, I'd wake up at 7, shower, put on the navy blue blazer I'd bought specifically for this presentation, and drive to the university with enough time to set up my equipment and review my notes one final time. Dr. Vasquez would introduce me to the committee, I'd deliver the presentation I'd been rehearsing for weeks, answer their questions, and hopefully walk out with approval to graduate and a recommendation for the housing authority position. The plan was perfect. The preparation was complete. What I didn't know was that while I slept, Dylan was still awake, sitting at his own computer in his room across the hall. What I didn't know was that my cloud storage password, the one I'd used for years and never changed, was the same password I'd used for the family Netflix account that Dylan had access to. What I didn't know was that my brother, the person who was supposed to want me to succeed, had his own presentation tomorrow morning. A presentation to the same Portland Housing Authority board that had expressed interest in my work. What I didn't know was that Dylan had spent the past 6 months positioning himself as a consultant who could revolutionize municipal housing policy through private sector innovation. He'd been dropping hints to potential clients about groundbreaking research he'd developed, comprehensive data he'd compiled, innovative solutions he'd designed. What I didn't know was that his entire consulting pitch was built on promises he couldn't keep, unless he had access to exactly the kind of detailed, researched, city-approved housing model that I'd spent 2 years developing. What I didn't know was that while I slept, confident in my backups and preparations, Dylan was systematically deleting every file related to my thesis from every location I'd saved it. My laptop's hard drive, wiped clean with a virus that would corrupt the operating system. My USB backup, reformatted after he'd quietly borrowed it from my desk while I brushed my teeth. My cloud storage account, emptied, and the deletion history cleared. But most importantly, what Dylan didn't know was that I'd grown up in the same house as him. I'd watched him manipulate situations and people for 26 years. And somewhere deep in my subconscious, even as I trusted him enough to show him my work, a small part of me had been preparing for exactly this kind of betrayal. I woke up at 7 a.m. to my alarm, showered quickly, and put on my blazer. I made coffee and toast, reviewing my presentation notes one final time while eating breakfast. At 8:15, I opened my laptop to transfer my presentation to a backup USB drive for extra security. The screen was black. Not sleeping black, but dead black. I pressed the power button. Nothing. I pressed it again, holding it longer. Still nothing. A cold dread started spreading through my chest as I checked the power cord, tried different outlets, removed and replaced the battery. My laptop was completely dead. "Okay," I said aloud to myself, trying to stay calm. This is why you make backups. I rushed to my desk drawer where I kept my USB drive. The small red sand disk wasn't in its usual spot. I dumped out the entire drawer, searching through pens and paper clips and old phone chargers. Nothing. I checked my backpack, my purse, under the bed, in the pockets of yesterday's clothes. The USB drive was gone. My hands were shaking now as I grabbed my phone and logged into my cloud storage account. I typed in my password, and for a moment felt relief when the login was successful. Then I saw the empty folder where my thesis files should have been. Nothing. Not just my presentation, but 2 years of research, interviews, photographs, budget models, correspondence with city officials, everything. All of it was gone. I ran downstairs to the kitchen, where Mom was making her morning coffee, still wearing her bathrobe and slippers. Mom, have you seen a red USB drive? It's really important. Patricia Winters looked up from the coffee maker with the slightly dazed expression she always wore before her second cup. A what, honey? A USB drive.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It's small and red and it has all my presentation files on it. I can't find it anywhere. I haven't seen anything like that. Dylan left early this morning, though. Maybe he saw it. The mention of Dylan leaving early sent another wave of dread through me. I checked the clock on the microwave. 8:47 a.m. My presentation was in 73 minutes, and I had nothing to present. I called Dylan's phone. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail again. I sent a text. Dylan, call me now. Emergency. No response. I ran back upstairs and tried everything I could think of. I attempted to restart my laptop in safe mode, tried booting from a recovery disk, even took the hard drive out and tried to connect it to Mom's old computer. Everything I tried led to the same result. Corrupted data, system failure, files not found. At 9:15, I was sitting on my bedroom floor, in my presentation blazer, surrounded by the pieces of my disassembled laptop, crying. Not the dignified tears of someone facing a setback, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone watching 2 years of work disappear an hour before the most important moment of their academic career. That's when Dylan appeared in my doorway. He was wearing a different suit than the one he'd had on yesterday, a sharp charcoal gray that I'd never seen before. His hair was perfectly styled, and he carried a leather portfolio that looked expensive. He looked like someone on his way to close a major deal. Czar? What happened? You look... I looked up at him through my tears, mascara probably running down my cheeks, laptop components scattered around me like the debris of my collapsed future. My presentation is gone. Everything's gone. My laptop died, my backup drive is missing, my cloud files are deleted. I don't understand how this could happen. Dylan stepped into my room and surveyed the scene with what appeared to be genuine concern. Oh no? That's terrible. Have you tried calling the university? Maybe they'll let you reschedule. I can't reschedule. The committee members are flying back to their home universities today. Dr. Vasquez spent months coordinating everyone's schedules. This was my only shot. I watched Dylan's face as I spoke, looking for any sign of satisfaction or guilt, but his expression remained perfectly sympathetic, concerned older brother trying to help his distraught sister. Guess you should have backed up your work, he said, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. There it was. Just for a split second, the corner of his mouth had twitched upward. Not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one. The same expression I'd seen when we were kids. And he'd convinced me to touch the electric fence at our cousin's farm, then acted surprised when I got shocked. I did back it up, I said slowly. In 3 different places. Dylan shrugged, adjusting his expensive portfolio. Technology fails sometimes. It's frustrating, but what can you do? He started to leave, then paused in the doorway, and looked back at me with what anyone else would have interpreted as brotherly sympathy. I'm really sorry this happened, Czar. I know how much this meant to you. But maybe it's a sign, you know? Maybe the universe is telling you that the nonprofit world isn't for you. You're smart, you could make real money in the private sector. I could even put in a good word for you with some of my contacts. And that's when I knew. Not suspected, knew. The way he said, real money. The timing of his early morning departure. The fact that he was dressed for the most important meeting of his life, while mine was falling apart. The way he'd asked to see my presentation last night, claiming he wanted to help. Dylan had destroyed my work. My own brother had sabotaged 2 years of my life to steal my research for his own presentation. While I sat on my bedroom floor crying, he was on his way to present my housing model to the Portland Housing Authority as his own innovative consulting solution. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse him. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me figure it out. Instead, I wiped my eyes and stood up, brushing the dust off my blazer. "You're right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Maybe this is a sign." Dylan's smile was genuine this time, warm and encouraging. "That's the spirit. You'll bounce back from this. You always do." After he left, I sat in the silence of my destroyed room and felt something shift inside me. The devastation was still there, the crushing disappointment, the grief for 2 years of lost work. But underneath it, something harder was beginning to crystallize. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let Dylan win. I called in sick to my teaching assistant position and spent the rest of that day walking through Portland's Pearl District in the rain, trying to process what had happened. The city looked different somehow, grayer and more indifferent than it had 24 hours earlier. I wandered past the boutique shops and expensive condos that had replaced the warehouses and artist lofts, wondering if this was what failure felt like, or if it was something else entirely. By evening, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going home. I found a small efficiency apartment for rent in a converted warehouse on the east side, the kind of place that catered to people who needed somewhere to land quickly and couldn't afford to be picky. The landlord, a woman named Rosa with paint-stained fingers and kind eyes, didn't ask many questions when I paid the first month's rent in cash from my emergency savings account. "Fresh start?" she asked, handing me the keys. "Something like that." The apartment was barely 400 square feet, with exposed brick walls and pipes running along the ceiling. It smelled faintly of turpentine and coffee from the roastery downstairs. There was a Murphy bed, a tiny kitchenette, and 2 large windows that faced west toward the industrial district. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I spent the first week in a strange state of suspended animation. I'd wake up each morning expecting to feel the crushing weight of my lost thesis, but instead I felt oddly hollow, like I was waiting for something to begin. I picked up extra shifts at a downtown coffee shop called Grind and Grove, work that kept my hands busy while my mind processed what Dylan had done. The customers were mostly tech workers and freelancers, people who spent hours hunched over laptops nursing single drinks. I found myself studying their faces, wondering what projects they were working on, whether anyone had ever tried to sabotage their work, whether they understood how fragile digital files really were. It was during my second week at the coffee shop that I met Celeste Rodriguez. She was a regular, always ordering the same drink at exactly 2:30 p.m., and always sitting at the corner table with the best natural light. She had dark hair cut in a sharp bob and wore vintage band t-shirts under expensive blazers, the kind of combination that suggested someone who'd figured out how to be professional without losing herself. "You're new," she said one afternoon, not as a question but as an observation. "New to the coffee shop, or new to being awake during daylight hours?" I asked, wiping down the counter. She smiled, and I noticed she had the kind of laugh lines that suggested someone who found genuine humor in the world despite whatever else was happening in her life. Both, maybe. "I'm Celeste. I run social media for a few local nonprofits. Zara. I make really excellent coffee and apparently have terrible judgment about family members. Those 2 things are probably related somehow." We started talking during my breaks, small conversations that gradually grew longer and more substantial. Celeste had a way of asking questions that didn't feel intrusive, and I found myself telling her about graduate school, about my thesis, about the morning everything disappeared. I didn't mention Dylan specifically, just said there had been a, quote, "a technical failure that cost me 2 years of work." "That's brutal," she said, stirring honey into her tea. "But you know, sometimes when something gets completely destroyed, it forces you to rebuild it better than it was before. Easy to say when it's not your life's work sitting in digital purgatory." "Fair point." But I've seen a lot of people bounce back from things that seemed impossible. Usually they come back stronger because they've learned something about themselves they didn't know before. I thought about that conversation for days afterward. Not the platitudes about bouncing back, but her comment about learning something new about yourself. What had I learned about myself in the 3 weeks since my presentation had been sabotaged? I'd learned that I was angrier than I'd realized. Not just about Dylan, but about years of being dismissed and overlooked. I'd learned that I was more resourceful than I'd given myself credit for, capable of starting over in a new place with minimal resources. And I'd learned that the work I'd been doing, the research about housing solutions and urban planning, still mattered to me even when it wasn't tied to a degree or a career advancement. I started volunteering at a homeless services center in Southeast Portland, not because I had any grand plan, but because I needed to be around the work that had originally inspired my thesis. The center was run by a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had left her position at the university to work directly with unhoused populations. "Zara," she said when I introduced myself as a former graduate student looking to volunteer, "I remember you. Your advisor mentioned your thesis defense was postponed due to technical difficulties." Something like that. Dr. Vasquez studied my face for a moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see more than I was saying. "Well, we can always use help with intake assessments and resource coordination. If you're interested in continuing your research in a more hands-on capacity." The work was different from academic research, but somehow more immediate and satisfying. I spent my mornings at the coffee shop and my afternoons at the services center, helping people navigate the complex bureaucracy of social services and emergency housing. The clients were the same people I'd interviewed for my thesis, but now instead of asking them questions for research purposes, I was trying to solve their actual problems. It was during my 4th week at the center that I met Kai Thompson, a housing coordinator who'd been working in the field for over a decade. He was maybe 10 years older than me, with graying temples and the kind of calm presence that suggested someone who'd seen everything, and somehow maintained both his sanity and his sense of humor. "You're the grad student who's been helping with the Mackenzie family housing search," he said, introducing himself during a staff meeting. "Former grad student. Now I'm just someone who makes coffee and occasionally helps people fill out forms. Those are both valuable skills, but I've been reading your intake notes, and they're more thorough than most of the social work majors we get as interns. You have a background in this?" I explained about my abandoned thesis, the 2 years of research that had disappeared overnight. Kai listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding in a way that suggested he understood both the professional and personal dimensions of what I was describing. "That's a significant loss," he said finally. "But the knowledge didn't disappear with the files. You still understand the systems, the policy frameworks, the real-world applications. Maybe this is an opportunity to approach the work differently." Meaning maybe instead of studying housing policy from an academic perspective, you could help develop it from a practitioner perspective. We're always looking for people who understand both the research side and the implementation challenges. That conversation planted a seed that took several more weeks to germinate. I continued working at the coffee shop and volunteering at the services center, gradually building a routine that felt sustainable, if not exactly ambitious. I was earning enough money to cover my rent and basic expenses, and I was doing work that felt meaningful, even if it wasn't the career path I'd originally planned. Then Celeste mentioned something that changed everything. "You know," she said one afternoon, scrolling through her laptop while I cleaned the espresso machine, "I keep seeing these social media posts about this amazing new housing initiative that's being pitched to the city council. Some consultant who claims to have developed a revolutionary approach to homeless services." I looked up from my cleaning. What kind of approach? Housing first model, integrated services, community-based support networks. The usual buzzwords, but apparently this guy has really detailed projections and case studies. The presentation is supposed to be next week. My hand stopped moving. "What's the consultant's name?" Celeste clicked through her browser history. "Dylan Winters. Do you know him?" I set down the cleaning rag very carefully and walked over to look at her screen. There was Dylan's professional headshot, the same charcoal suit he'd been wearing the morning my presentation disappeared. Below his photo was a description of his innovative research into sustainable housing solutions, his quote-quote comprehensive analysis of Portland's homeless crisis, and his quote 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 quote. Every single bullet point was lifted directly from my thesis proposal. "Can you forward me this link?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Sure. You thinking about applying for a job with his firm?" Something like that. I spent that evening reading everything I could find about Dylan's consulting practice. His website was sleek and professional, full of stock photos of diverse people shaking hands in modern office spaces. His bio described him as a, quote, social innovation strategist with extensive experience in municipal policy development and community engagement. There were testimonials from previous clients, case studies of successful projects, and a portfolio of white papers on topics ranging from affordable housing to urban sustainability. Everything looked legitimate and impressive, except for one problem. I recognized most of the language from my own research. Not just similar ideas or parallel thinking, but exact phrases, specific data points, and organizational frameworks that I'd spent months developing. Dylan hadn't just stolen my thesis presentation. He'd built his entire consulting business around my work. I opened a new document on my laptop and began making a list. Every web page, every testimonial, every project description that contained language or concepts from my research. I screenshotted everything, noting dates and URLs and specific passages. By midnight, I had 47 pages of documentation showing a systematic pattern of intellectual theft spanning at least 6 months. The next morning, I called in sick to the coffee shop and spent the day at the Portland State Library, accessing academic databases and city planning documents from my old student account. I pulled every source I'd cited in my original research, every interview transcript, every budget analysis I'd compiled with help from municipal planning offices. What I found was even more damaging than I'd expected. Dylan hadn't just stolen my work. He'd presented preliminary versions of my research to at least 3 different clients over the past year, collecting payment for consulting services that consisted entirely of my intellectual property. One email chain, which I found through a public records request to the city planning office, showed Dylan pitching my housing model to Gresham City Council 8 months ago. Another document showed him presenting my cost-benefit analysis to Washington County's Housing Authority in June. Each time, he'd positioned himself as the original researcher and developer of the solutions I'd spent 2 years creating. I printed everything: financial records, email correspondence, project proposals, client testimonials. I organized it chronologically, cross-referenced it with my own research timeline, and created a comprehensive dossier that told a clear story. Dylan Winters had systematically stolen his sister's graduate research and used it to build a fraudulent consulting career. By Thursday afternoon, I had enough evidence to destroy Dylan's business and potentially get him charged with fraud. The question was what to do with it. I could have gone to the university, reported the academic misconduct, and demanded that Dylan be held accountable through official channels. I could have contacted his clients directly, exposed the plagiarism, and let his professional reputation collapse under the weight of the evidence. Instead, I decided to wait. Dylan's big presentation to the Portland Housing Authority was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The same presentation that was supposed to have been mine, delivered to the same board that had expressed interest in my original research. I wanted to see exactly how far he was willing to take this, how completely he was prepared to claim ownership of my work. I spent the weekend preparing for a different kind of presentation. Not an academic defense, but something more personal and strategic. I researched the Housing Authority board members, learned their backgrounds and policy priorities. I studied Dylan's consulting website more carefully, noting every claim he'd made about his expertise and experience. Most importantly, I practiced telling the story, not with anger or accusation, but with the calm professionalism of someone who had done the work and could prove it. On Monday evening, I received a text from my mother. "Dylan's presentation is tomorrow morning. The whole family's going to support him. You should come." I stared at the message for a long time before responding, "I'll be there." Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather in Portland. I put on the same navy blue blazer I'd worn for my failed thesis defense, but this time I felt different wearing it. Not nervous or hopeful, but purposeful. The Portland Housing Authority offices were downtown in a glass building that reflected the morning clouds. I arrived early and sat in the lobby, watching Dylan set up his presentation equipment in the conference room. He wore the same charcoal suit, carried the same leather portfolio, moved with the same confident energy I'd observed the morning he'd destroyed my work. My parents arrived 20 minutes before the presentation was scheduled to begin. Patricia and Michael Winters, looking proud and slightly nervous, the way parents look when they're about to watch their child perform in a school play. They didn't see me sitting in the lobby corner, and I didn't announce myself. At exactly 10 o'clock, Dylan began his presentation to the Portland Housing Authority Board. I couldn't hear the words from the lobby, but I could see him through the glass walls, gesturing confidently at slides that displayed my research, my data, my solutions to Portland's housing crisis. He presented for 37 minutes. I know because I timed it. When he finished, there was applause. Board members shook his hand, exchanged business cards, discussed implementation timelines and budget allocations. Dylan smiled the same smile I'd seen him use since childhood, the one that suggested he'd always known things would work out in his favor. Then I stood up, straightened my blazer, and walked into the conference room. "Excuse me," I said to the board chairperson. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the research that was just presented." Dylan's face went white when he saw me. For the first time since we were children, I had the satisfaction of seeing him genuinely surprised. "I'm Dr. Zara Winters," I continued, even though I hadn't yet defended my thesis or earned the title. "And I'm the actual author of the housing model you just heard described." The room went very quiet. I opened my own portfolio and began distributing copies of the documentation I'd prepared. Original research notes with timestamps, email correspondence with city planning offices, interview transcripts with my signature, budget analyses that showed my methodology and calculations. "Everything Mr. Winters just presented to you," I said calmly, "is my intellectual property. Property that he stole from my graduate research and has been using to defraud clients for the past year." I spent the next 45 minutes walking the board through my evidence. I showed them the timeline of my research development alongside Dylan's consulting contracts. I presented email exchanges that proved he'd accessed my work without permission. I demonstrated point by point how every innovative solution in his presentation had originated from my thesis research. Dylan sat frozen in his chair, his confident smile long since disappeared. My parents watched from the back of the room with expressions of growing horror as the scope of what their son had done became undeniable. When I finished, the board chairperson asked Dylan if he had any response to the allegations. "This is a family dispute," he said finally, his voice much smaller than it had been during his presentation. "My sister is upset because her graduate program didn't work out, and she's trying to sabotage my career out of jealousy." I opened my laptop and pulled up one final piece of evidence, a screen recording I'd made of Dylan's consulting website, showing him claiming credit for research that predated his business by 18 months. "Mr. Winters," I said, "deleted my thesis files the night before my scheduled defense to prevent me from presenting this research to academic committee. He systematically destroyed my backup files and then used my work to build his consulting practice. This isn't a family dispute. It's intellectual property theft and fraud." The meeting ended with the Housing Authority Board agreeing to postpone any decisions about Dylan's proposal pending a full investigation into the ownership of the research. They asked me to submit my original documentation for review and requested that I present my own version of the housing model at their next monthly meeting. Dylan left without speaking to me or our parents. I watched him walk across the parking lot toward his BMW, his expensive portfolio hanging at his side like dead weight. My mother approached me as I was packing up my materials. Her face was pale, and she looked older than she had that morning. "Zara," she said quietly, "we didn't know. We had no idea that Dylan had, that he would do something like this." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had watched Dylan dismiss and undermine me for 26 years without ever questioning his behavior, who had driven to his presentation to show support without ever asking why I wasn't presenting my own work. "Yes, you did," I said, not unkindly but without softening the truth. You've always known exactly who Dylan is. You just never cared enough to protect me from him. I left the building and walked the 6 blocks back to my apartment in the Pearl District, the same route I'd taken the day after my thesis defense had been sabotaged. But this time the city looked different. Not indifferent or gray, but full of possibilities I was finally prepared to claim. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Dylan. The voicemails started at 6:23 a.m. Dylan's voice was different than I'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual confidence and edged with something that might have been panic. "Zara, we need to talk. This whole thing yesterday got blown out of proportion. Call me back." The second message came 12 minutes later. "Look, I know you're angry, but we're family. We can work this out without involving lawyers or the media. Just call me." By message 7, his tone had shifted from conciliatory to desperate. The Oregonian wants to do a story. Some blogger is calling it sibling rivalry or corporate fraud. You need to make this stop. I listened to each voicemail while drinking coffee in my small kitchen, watching the sunrise paint the brick walls of my apartment golden. There was something almost surreal about hearing Dylan beg. In 26 years, I'd never heard him ask anyone for anything. He demanded, manipulated, charmed, or simply took what he wanted. But begging was new territory. The final message had come in at 11:47 p.m. the night before. "Zara, please. My clients are pulling their contracts. The housing authority is launching a formal investigation. I could lose everything. We both know you don't really want to destroy me. That's not who you are." He was right about one thing. Destroying Dylan wasn't who I'd been. The old Zara would have felt guilty about the desperation in his voice, would have worried about the impact on our parents, would have found some way to minimize the damage, while quietly accepting that her work would remain uncredited. But something fundamental had shifted during those weeks of rebuilding my life from scratch. I'd discovered that I was tired of being the person who absorbed other people's problems to keep the peace. I deleted the voicemails without responding and got ready for work. At Grind and Grove, Celeste was waiting at her usual table with an expression I'd never seen before. Instead of her typical vintage band t-shirt, she wore a crisp white button-down and dark jeans, and her laptop was surrounded by printed articles and legal documents. "We need to talk," she said as I approached with her usual afternoon tea. I set down her cup and noticed the headline of the newspaper beside her laptop. "Local consultant under investigation for alleged research theft." "You didn't mention your brother was Dylan Winters," she said, not accusingly but with the tone of someone who just connected dots she wished she hadn't needed to connect. I sat down across from her, suddenly aware that our comfortable friendship was about to become more complicated. "You didn't ask his name. Fair point." She turned her laptop screen toward me. "But I've been doing some digging since yesterday, and this story is bigger than just what happened at the housing authority meeting." What Celeste had found in less than 24 hours was both more comprehensive and more damaging than anything I'd uncovered during my week of research. She'd traced Dylan's consulting work back 3 years, identifying at least 12 different projects where he'd claimed credit for research, methodologies, or data analysis that could be traced to other sources. "Your thesis wasn't his first victim," she said, scrolling through a timeline she'd created. "Look at this housing project in Salem. The community engagement model he presented? It's lifted almost entirely from a graduate student's work at Willamette University. And this cost-benefit analysis for Ben's affordable housing initiative? Originally developed by a nonprofit researcher who never got credited." I stared at the screen, feeling a mixture of vindication and nausea. Dylan hadn't just stolen from me. He'd built his entire professional identity around appropriating other people's work. "How did you find all this?" "I have a background in investigative journalism before I moved into nonprofit communications. Once you know what patterns to look for, it's not that hard to trace." She closed the laptop and looked at me directly. "The question is what you want to do with this information." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've exposed the theft of your specific research, and that's important. But there are other victims here, People who don't even know their work was stolen. You could stop with your own case, or you could help bring down a systematic pattern of intellectual property fraud. That afternoon, instead of going to my volunteer shift at the services center, I met with 3 other people whose work Dylan had appropriated. Marcus Chen, the Willamette graduate student whose community engagement model had been plagiarized, Dr. Sarah Okafor, the nonprofit researcher whose cost-benefit analysis had been stolen, and Jennifer Liu, an urban planning consultant whose sustainable development framework had been rebranded under Dylan's consulting firm. We met at a quiet coffee shop in Southeast Portland, and the similarities in our experiences were both striking and infuriating. In each case, Dylan had gained access to our work through professional networking, academic conferences, or mutual connections. He'd positioned himself as a collaborator or potential partner, expressed enthusiasm for our research, and then systematically incorporated our ideas into his own consulting practice without attribution or compensation. I thought I was paranoid when I started noticing similarities between his presentations and my work, Marcus said, stirring sugar into his coffee with shaking hands. But I convinced myself it was just parallel thinking, that maybe these ideas weren't as original as I'd thought. Dr. Okafor nodded grimly. He has a way of making you doubt your own work. When I saw my analysis presented at a housing conference last year, I questioned whether I'd somehow gotten the attribution wrong, whether maybe I'd built on his research instead of the other way around. That's exactly what he did to me, Jennifer added. He made me feel like I should be grateful that someone with his platform was interested in my ideas, even when he never mentioned my name in connection with the work. As we compared notes and shared documentation, a clearer picture emerged of Dylan's methods. He was strategic about targeting researchers who were early in their careers, people who lacked the professional networks or institutional support to challenge his appropriation of their work. He was careful to modify our research just enough that casual observers might not notice the plagiarism, but not enough to mask the underlying concepts and methodologies. Most insidiously, he had a talent for making his victims feel complicit in their own exploitation. Each of us had initially been flattered by his interest, grateful for the attention from someone who seemed successful and well-connected. By the time we realized what was happening, he'd already established himself as the public face of our work. "The question is what we do now," Dr. Okafor said as our meeting stretched into the early evening. "Zara's already exposed him publicly, but that doesn't necessarily help the rest of us." I'd been thinking about this question since Celeste had shown me the scope of Dylan's fraud. Individual cases of plagiarism could be dismissed as misunderstandings or academic disputes. But a documented pattern of systematic theft was something different entirely. "We file a coordinated complaint," I said, "not just with individual institutions, but with the state attorney general's office. Fraud is fraud, whether it's financial or intellectual property." Over the next 2 weeks, with Celeste's help, we assembled a comprehensive case against Dylan Winters and his consulting practice. We documented 12 separate instances of intellectual property theft, traced the financial benefits he'd received from presenting stolen work, and identified additional victims who hadn't yet realized their research had been appropriated. The evidence was overwhelming. Email chains showing Dylan soliciting access to preliminary research under false pretenses. Conference presentations where he'd claimed credit for methodologies he couldn't explain when questioned by experts. Client testimonials praising his innovative approaches that were actually our innovative approaches. We also uncovered the financial scope of his fraud. Over 3 years, Dylan had earned approximately $340,000 from consulting contracts based entirely or partially on stolen research. He'd used our work to establish his credibility, win new clients, and build a professional reputation that had no basis in his actual expertise. The coordinated complaint we filed painted a picture of someone who had deliberately and systematically built a career on intellectual property theft. But more than that, it showed how Dylan had exploited the vulnerabilities of early career researchers who lacked the resources or institutional support to protect their work. 3 days after we submitted our complaint, Dylan showed up at my apartment. I was coming home from the coffee shop when I saw him sitting on the front steps of my building, still wearing expensive clothes but looking haggard in a way I'd never seen before. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping. "We need to talk," he said, standing up as I approached. No, we don't. I tried to walk past him, but he moved to block my path. Not aggressively, but with the desperate energy of someone who'd run out of other options. Zara, please. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Against my better judgment, I let him follow me up to my apartment. The space felt smaller with Dylan in it, his presence somehow diminishing the sanctuary I'd created for myself. He looked around at my exposed brick walls, my secondhand furniture, my small kitchen, and I could see him cataloging the difference between my modest life and the affluent lifestyle his stolen work had funded. This is nice, he said, though his tone suggested he found my circumstances more pitiable than impressive. What do you want, Dylan? He sat down on my couch without being invited and ran his hands through his hair. I want to make this right. I know I made mistakes, and I'm prepared to make amends. Mistakes? I remained standing, arms crossed. Is that what you're calling it? I never meant for things to go this far. When I first started incorporating some of your ideas into my presentations, it was just... I was trying to help both of us. I thought if I could get these concepts in front of the right people, it would benefit everyone. The audacity of this revision was breathtaking. Dylan was attempting to reframe years of systematic theft as misguided altruism, to position himself as someone who'd been trying to help me by stealing my work and claiming credit for it. Help me, I repeated, by destroying my thesis defense and building your career on my research. I didn't destroy anything. Your computer crashed. Technology fails sometimes. I stared at him, amazed that he was still trying to maintain the fiction that my laptop had died by coincidence. Dylan, I have documentation showing that you accessed my cloud storage account the night before my defense. I have recovery logs from my USB drive showing it was deliberately reformatted. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out? For the first time, his composure cracked completely. Fine. Yes, I deleted your files. But I was under enormous pressure. I'd already committed to the Housing Authority presentation, and I panicked. I thought you'd just reschedule your defense, and everything would work out. You thought I'd just reschedule 2 years of work because it was convenient for your fraud. It wasn't fraud. It was collaboration. We're family. What's yours is mine, right? The casual entitlement in that statement hit me like a physical blow. Dylan genuinely believed that being my brother gave him ownership rights to my intellectual property, that family relationship trumped professional ethics and personal boundaries. What's mine is mine, I said quietly. And what you did wasn't collaboration. It was theft. Dylan's expression shifted from desperation to something harder. You know what's going to happen if you keep pushing this, right? The investigation, the media attention, the legal proceedings. It's going to destroy our entire family. Mom and Dad are already humiliated. Do you really want to put them through years of public scandal? This was vintage Dylan, pivoting from self-pity to emotional manipulation when direct appeals failed. He was trying to make me responsible for the consequences of his actions, to guilt me into protecting him by framing his punishment as harm to our parents. Mom and Dad will recover, I said. The question is whether you will. Is that a threat? It's a prediction. You built your entire professional identity on work you stole from other people. When that becomes public knowledge, which it will, what do you think happens to your consulting practice? Your reputation, your ability to work in this field again? Dylan stood up abruptly, his attempt at reasonable negotiation abandoned. You're really going to destroy me over this? Your own brother? I'm not destroying you, Dylan. I'm just refusing to let you destroy me anymore. He left without another word, and I watched from my window as he got into his BMW and drove away. I realized that this was probably the last conversation we'd ever have, the final dissolution of a relationship that had been built on inequality and exploitation for as long as I could remember. The next morning, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my apartment door sometime during the night. Inside was a check for $50,000 made out to me personally, along with a handwritten note. This covers your thesis research and any inconvenience I may have caused. Cash it, and we can both move on. I took a photo of the check and the note, then tore both into small pieces and threw them away. Dylan still didn't understand that this wasn't about money or convenience. It was about recognition, accountability, and the principle that people shouldn't be able to build careers on work they'd stolen from others. Later that week, the Oregon Attorney General's office announced that they were opening a formal investigation into Dylan Winters' consulting practice. The announcement was covered by local media, and within days the story had been picked up by national outlets interested in the unusual case of sibling rivalry turned intellectual property fraud. Dylan's consulting website went dark. His social media accounts disappeared. Former clients began distancing themselves from projects associated with his work, and several pending contracts were quietly canceled. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Vasquez, my former advisor who was now working at the Homeless Services Center, called to tell me that the Portland Housing Authority had voted to move forward with implementing my housing model, crediting me as the primary researcher and offering me a position as project coordinator. They were impressed not just with the quality of your research, she said, but with the integrity you showed in exposing the plagiarism. They want someone they can trust to oversee the implementation. The position came with a salary that would allow me to move out of my tiny efficiency apartment, complete my graduate degree, and begin the career I'd originally planned before Dylan's sabotage derailed my thesis defense. But more than the practical benefits, it represented recognition that my work had value independent of my family dynamics, that my ideas were worth implementing regardless of who tried to claim credit for them. I accepted the position and gave notice at the coffee shop. On my last day at Grindon Grove, Celeste presented me with a framed newspaper clipping of the story about the Attorney General's investigation, with a handwritten note. For someone who learned that family doesn't always mean loyalty, but loyalty always means standing up for what's right. As I packed up my few belongings from the coffee shop, I reflected on how much had changed since the morning I'd discovered my deleted files. I'd gone from being someone who absorbed other people's problems to someone who created consequences for people who tried to exploit me. I'd learned that my work had value not because Dylan had stolen it, but because it offered real solutions to real problems. Most importantly, I'd discovered that I didn't need my family's approval or validation to build a meaningful life. The relationships I'd formed with Celeste, with my fellow fraud victims, with the clients at the Homeless Services Center, were based on mutual respect and shared values rather than biological obligation and historical habit. 3 months later, I was settling into my new role coordinating the Portland Housing Initiative when I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Marcus Chen, the Willamette graduate student whose work Dylan had plagiarized, knocked on my door with a proposition. "I've been thinking about what you said during our first meeting," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "about how Dylan targeted early career researchers who lacked institutional support. I think there's an opportunity here to do something preventative rather than just reactive." Marcus had been developing an idea for a nonprofit organization focused on protecting intellectual property rights for graduate students and early career researchers. The organization would provide legal resources, document authentication services, and advocacy support for people whose work had been plagiarized or appropriated. "We could call it the Research Integrity Project," he said, showing me a preliminary proposal he'd drafted. "Not just responding to theft after it happens, but helping people protect their work before it gets stolen." The idea was compelling, and as Marcus outlined his vision, I realized it addressed a systemic problem that extended far beyond Dylan's individual crimes. Young researchers were particularly vulnerable to exploitation because they often lacked the professional networks, institutional support, and legal resources needed to protect their work. Over the following months, Marcus, Dr. Okafor, Jennifer Liu, and I worked together to establish the Research Integrity Project. We secured initial funding from a foundation interested in supporting academic ethics, recruited volunteer attorneys specializing in intellectual property law, and began developing resources to help researchers document and protect their work. The organization's first major success came when we helped a doctoral student at Oregon State University prove that her dissertation research had been appropriated by a senior faculty member. The case resulted in the faculty member's resignation and led to significant changes in the university's policies around research collaboration and attribution. Within a year, we were handling dozens of cases across multiple states, and our resource guides were being used by universities and research institutions throughout the Pacific Northwest. What had begun as a response to personal victimization had evolved into a systematic effort to prevent intellectual property theft in academic and research settings. Dylan's case became our template for understanding how plagiarism networks operated and our motivation for ensuring that other victims had better resources than we'd initially possessed. The Research Integrity Project grew into something larger than any of us had imagined. not despite the theft of our work, but because of how we chose to respond to it. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dylan's attempt to build his career on stolen research had ultimately led to the creation of an organization dedicated to preventing exactly that kind of exploitation. His fraud had backfired in ways he never could have anticipated, generating consequences that extended far beyond his individual punishment to create systemic change in how intellectual property theft was identified and addressed. The Research Integrity Project had been operating for 18 months when we received the case that would change everything. A young woman named Avery Kim contacted us through our website, claiming that her master's thesis on sustainable agriculture had been stolen by a professor at her own university and published under his name in a prestigious academic journal. What made Avery's case different wasn't the theft itself, but the response she'd received when she reported it. Instead of investigating her claims, the university had suggested she was mistaken about the originality of her research and recommended she seek counseling for what they termed academic stress and paranoia. When she persisted, they'd placed her on academic probation for making unfounded accusations against faculty. "They're not just protecting the professor," Avery explained during our initial video call, her voice shaking with frustration. "They're actively punishing me for speaking up. I'm losing my funding, my advisor won't meet with me, and other faculty members have been told I'm difficult to work with." As I listened to Avery's story, I felt a familiar anger building in my chest. Not the hot, impulsive rage I might have felt years earlier, but the cold, focused anger that came from understanding exactly how institutional power could be used to silence victims and protect perpetrators. Marcus, who was handling most of our case intake by this point, shared the documentation Avery had compiled. The evidence was overwhelming. Side-by-side comparisons of her thesis and the published paper showed identical passages, methodologies, and even the same grammatical errors she'd made in early drafts. Email timestamps proved she'd submitted her research months before the professor claimed to have developed his quote, groundbreaking agricultural model. "This isn't just plagiarism," Dr. Okafor observed during our weekly team meeting. "It's institutional retaliation. They're using their power to discredit the victim instead of addressing the crime." Jennifer Liu nodded grimly. "And if we don't take this case, what message does that send to other students who might be facing similar situations? That they should stay quiet to protect their academic futures?" The decision to represent Avery was unanimous, but we all understood the implications. Taking on a university meant challenging an institution with significant resources, legal representation, and reputational interests to protect. It was a different kind of fight than exposing an individual consultant like Dylan. I volunteered to be the primary advocate on Avery's case, partly because I had the most experience with media attention, but mainly because her situation reminded me so strongly of my own. The same pattern of institutional gaslighting, the same attempt to make the victim question their own reality, the same assumption that speaking up was more dangerous than staying silent. Our first step was documenting everything. Avery provided us with her complete academic file, including correspondence with faculty members, her funding records, and transcripts of meetings where she'd been told to, quote, to reconsider her position on the plagiarism allegations. We also obtained copies of the professor's published paper and traced its development timeline through academic databases and conference presentations. The pattern that emerged was even more disturbing than we'd initially suspected. Dr. Raymond Hutchins, the professor who'd stolen Avery's work, had a 20-year career built on appropriating student research. We found at least 8 instances where his published papers contained substantial portions of work, originally developed by graduate students in his program. What made his system particularly insidious was how he structured his relationships with students. Dr. Hutchins would require extensive preliminary research from students before officially approving their thesis topics, claiming he needed to ensure their projects were, quote, sufficiently original and rigorous. Students would spend months developing comprehensive research proposals, literature reviews, and preliminary findings, all of which Hutchins would review and critique in detail. If a student's research showed particular promise, Hutchins would suggest collaborative opportunities that involved sharing their work with his professional network. Students who agreed found themselves credited as research assistants on papers they'd essentially authored. Students who declined would have their thesis proposals rejected for being, quote, insufficiently developed or lacking in original contribution. Students who challenged the system faced the same treatment Avery had experienced: academic probation, loss of funding, damaged relationships with other faculty members, and ultimately the choice between abandoning their education or accepting that their work would be appropriated without proper credit. He's created a systematic pipeline of intellectual property theft. I explained to a reporter from the Chronicle of Higher Education who'd expressed interest in the story, and the university has enabled it by refusing to investigate complaints and punishing students who speak up. The media attention that followed our public exposure of Hutchins' plagiarism network was swift and intense. Academic Twitter exploded with discussions about power dynamics in graduate education. Current and former students from multiple universities began sharing their own experiences with faculty members who'd appropriated their work. Most importantly, other students who'd been victimized by Dr. Hutchins began coming forward. Within 2 weeks of our initial press conference, we'd heard from 12 additional students who'd had their research stolen, their complaints dismissed, or their academic careers sabotaged for challenging his behavior. The university's initial response was predictable: deny everything, attack the credibility of the accusers, and claim that any similarities between student work and published papers were the result of legitimate collaboration. They hired a prestigious law firm to represent both the institution and Dr. Hutchins, and they launched what they called an internal review of the allegations. But their defensive strategy backfired when we released the full scope of documentation we'd compiled. Email chains showing Hutchins explicitly claiming credit for student ideas, conference presentations where he'd presented research without acknowledging student contributions, published papers where entire sections had been lifted verbatim from student thesis proposals. The evidence was so comprehensive that even the university's hired investigators couldn't dismiss it. Within a month, Dr. Hutchins had been placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. The journal that had published Avery's stolen research issued a retraction, and the university announced they were conducting a, quote, comprehensive review of research attribution practices across all departments. But the real victory came when the university's Board of Trustees voted to establish new policies requiring transparent documentation of all student-faculty research collaborations, mandatory training on intellectual property ethics for all faculty members, and an independent ombudsman office to investigate allegations of academic misconduct. Avery's academic probation was reversed, her funding was restored, and she was assigned to a new advisor who helped her complete her thesis and defend it successfully. More than that, she'd become a powerful advocate for other students facing similar exploitation, testifying at academic conferences, and helping to draft model policies for protecting student intellectual property. The Hutchins case established the Research Integrity Project as a serious force in academic accountability. We started receiving funding from major foundations interested in research ethics, consulting requests from universities wanting to review their policies, and partnership offers from legal organizations specializing in intellectual property law. But success brought new challenges. Our small team was being overwhelmed by case requests, and the complexity of institutional fights required resources we didn't have. We needed to expand, professionalize, and systematize our operations if we wanted to continue making meaningful impact. That's when I received an unexpected phone call from someone I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years. My mother. Zara. Patricia Winters. Voice sounded tired and older than I remembered. I've been following the news about your organization. What you've accomplished is remarkable. I was sitting in my office at the Portland Housing Authority, reviewing preliminary reports on our housing initiative's first year of implementation. The program was exceeding all projections for both cost-effectiveness and client outcomes, and I'd just finished a presentation to the City Council about expanding the model statewide. Thank you, I said carefully, uncertain where this conversation was heading. I owe you an apology, several apologies actually. Your father and we enabled Dylan's behavior for years. We saw how he treated you, how he dismissed your work, how he took credit for things that weren't his. And we told ourselves it was just sibling rivalry, that you were both being dramatic. I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair. This was not a conversation I'd expected to have. When the investigation results came out, she continued, when we saw the scope of what he'd done, not just to you but to all those other people, we realized we'd been complicit. We'd raised someone who thought other people's work belonged to him, and we'd failed to protect the daughter who was trying to make the world better. The apology I'd waited years to hear felt strangely anticlimactic when it finally came, not because it didn't matter, but because I'd built a life that no longer depended on parental validation or family acceptance. I appreciate you saying that, I said. But I'm not sure what you want me to do with it. Nothing. I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. I just wanted you to know that we see you now. We see what you've built, the people you've helped, the systems you've changed, and we're proud of you, even if we don't deserve to be. After we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, processing emotions I'd thought I'd already worked through. The validation felt good, but it also felt irrelevant. I had learned to measure my worth by the impact of my work, rather than the approval of my family. That evening, I met Celeste for dinner at a restaurant in the Pearl District, not far from the efficiency apartment where I'd started rebuilding my life 3 years earlier. She'd recently been promoted to communications director for a coalition of housing advocacy organizations, and we'd maintained our friendship even as our professional paths had diverged. "You're quiet tonight," she observed, cutting into her salmon. "Everything okay with the expansion planning?" I'd been working with Marcus and our board of directors on plans to open research integrity project offices in 3 additional states, funded by a major grant from the Ford Foundation. The expansion would allow us to handle more cases, provide more comprehensive legal support, and develop educational resources for universities across the country. "Actually, I think I'm going to step back from day-to-day operations," I said, surprising myself with the statement. "I want to focus more on policy development and systemic change." Celeste raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like you have a specific plan in mind." I'd been thinking about this decision for months, ever since the Hutchins case had demonstrated how much more effective we could be when we addressed institutional problems rather than just individual cases. The Research Integrity Project had proven that intellectual property theft was a widespread, systematic issue that required comprehensive solutions. "I want to work on federal legislation," I said, "real legal protections for student and early career researcher intellectual property, mandatory disclosure requirements for research collaborations, standardized procedures for investigating plagiarism allegations." The idea had been developing since my conversation with several congressional staffers who'd reached out after reading about our work. There was growing interest in Washington about research integrity issues, particularly as concerns about scientific misconduct and academic fraud had begun attracting mainstream media attention. "That's ambitious," Celeste said, "and probably necessary. But are you ready for that kind of political fight?" I thought about the question while finishing my dinner. 3 years earlier, I'd been someone who avoided conflict, who absorbed criticism to keep peace, who let other people claim credit for my work to avoid making waves. The woman I'd become was someone who created consequences for people who exploited others, who built systems to prevent institutional abuse, who wasn't afraid to challenge powerful organizations when they protected perpetrators at the expense of victims. "I think I've been preparing for it my whole life," I said. 2 months later, I was testifying before a House subcommittee on research integrity, explaining how current intellectual property protections failed to address the power dynamics that made student researchers vulnerable to exploitation. My testimony was based not just on theoretical understanding, but on hundreds of cases the Research Integrity Project had handled, representing a comprehensive view of how plagiarism networks operated and how they could be disrupted. The hearing room was packed with academic administrators, legal scholars, and student advocates. In the front row, I could see Marcus Chen, who'd flown in from Portland to provide technical testimony about our documentation methods. Dr. Okafor was scheduled to speak after me about the financial impact of research theft on early career academics. But the moment that struck me most powerfully came when I looked up at the gallery and saw Avery Kim, now completing her PhD at a different university and working as a graduate student organizer for research rights. She gave me a small nod of encouragement, and I remembered the frightened young woman who'd contacted us 2 years earlier, convinced that her academic career was over, because she'd dared to challenge institutional authority. The theft of intellectual property from students and early career researchers isn't just an individual crime, I told the subcommittee. It's a systematic abuse of power that undermines the integrity of academic research and discourages the next generation of scholars from pursuing innovative work. I presented our data showing that intellectual property theft disproportionately affected women, people of color, and first-generation college students, demographics that were already underrepresented in academic leadership positions. I explained how current legal frameworks provided inadequate protection for victims and insufficient consequences for perpetrators. Most importantly, I outlined a comprehensive policy proposal that would create federal standards for research attribution, establish legal remedies for intellectual property theft in academic settings, and require institutions receiving federal research funding to implement transparent procedures for investigating misconduct allegations. The legislation we were proposing wasn't just about punishment after theft occurred, but about prevention through systemic change. Mandatory documentation of research contributions, standardized contracts for student-faculty collaboration, independent oversight of misconduct investigations, and whistleblower protections for people who reported plagiarism. Change is possible, I concluded, but it requires institutional accountability and legal frameworks that protect the people who do the work, not just the people who claim credit for it. The hearing lasted 4 hours and covered testimony from dozens of witnesses representing universities, student organizations, legal experts, and research integrity advocates. The questions from committee members were detailed and substantive, suggesting genuine interest in developing comprehensive legislation. As I packed up my materials after the hearing, Representative Maria Gonzalez approached me with a proposal that would change my career trajectory once again. "Ms. Winters," she said, "I'd like you to consider joining my staff as a legislative aide specializing in research integrity issues. We're going to need someone with your expertise to help draft this legislation and build support for it." The offer was intriguing, but complicated. Working in Congress would mean leaving Portland, stepping away from direct service work, and engaging with political processes I'd only observed from a distance. But it also represented an opportunity to create change at a scale I'd never imagined possible. That evening, I walked through the National Mall, thinking about how far I'd traveled from the morning I'd discovered my deleted files. I'd gone from being someone whose work was stolen and erased to someone who was testifying before Congress about intellectual property protection. I'd built an organization that had helped hundreds of victims, changed policies at dozens of institutions, and was now influencing federal legislation. But the most significant change wasn't professional or public, it was personal. I'd learned that my worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition or approval. I'd discovered that I could create consequences for people who tried to exploit me. And I'd proven to myself that building something meaningful was more satisfying than seeking revenge against people who'd tried to tear me down. I called Celeste from my hotel room that night to discuss the congressional offer. "It sounds like the logical next step," she said. "You've proven that individual advocacy works, that institutional change is possible, and now you have a chance to create systemic reform at the federal level. But it also means starting over again in a new city, learning new systems, building new relationships. You've done that before. Successfully." She was right. I'd rebuilt my life from scratch multiple times. After Dylan's sabotage, when I'd started working at the coffee shop and volunteering at the services center, when I'd taken the housing authority position and moved into policy work, when I'd co-founded the Research Integrity Project and learned to become an advocate. Each transition had required letting go of previous identities and embracing new challenges, but each had also led to greater impact, broader influence, and deeper satisfaction with the work I was doing. The next morning, I accepted Representative Gonzalez's offer and began planning my move to Washington, D.C. The Research Integrity Project would continue under Marcus's leadership, with Dr. Okafor and Jennifer Liu taking expanded roles in operations and legal advocacy. I would maintain an advisory position while focusing on federal policy development. As I prepared to leave Portland, I realized that Dylan's attempt to destroy my thesis defense had ultimately led to changes he never could have anticipated. His fraud had exposed systematic problems in research integrity that needed addressing. His exploitation had motivated me to become an advocate for other victims. His betrayal had taught me that family loyalty shouldn't require accepting abuse or theft. The housing initiative I'd developed was now being implemented in 6 different cities, providing stable housing for hundreds of formerly homeless individuals. The Research Integrity Project had helped over 300 victims of intellectual property theft and had influenced policy changes at more than 40 universities. The federal legislation we were proposing could protect thousands of future researchers from the kind of exploitation I'd experienced. None of this would have happened if Dylan hadn't deleted my files that October morning. His attempt to steal my future had inadvertently created a much larger future than I'd originally imagined for myself. Washington, D.C. in January was everything Portland wasn't. Cold, formal, and relentlessly political. I'd rented a small studio apartment in Capitol Hill, walking distance from the office building, where Representative Gonzalez's staff worked on education policy and research integrity legislation. The city's rhythm was different from anything I'd experienced, driven by news cycles, voting schedules, and the constant undercurrent of power negotiations. My first month on congressional staff was a crash course in political reality. The research integrity bill we'd been developing faced opposition from university lobbying groups who argued that federal oversight would stifle academic innovation. Conservative legislators worried about government overreach into educational institutions. Even some progressive allies questioned whether intellectual property protection was a priority, compared to broader issues like student debt and education funding. "Welcome to the sausage factory," said Jake Morrison, Representative Gonzalez's chief of staff, during my orientation. "Good policy and actual legislation are two very different things. Our job is figuring out how to turn your expertise into something that can actually pass." The learning curve was steep. I spent days reading previous education bills, studying congressional procedures, and learning the informal networks that determined which proposals received serious consideration. The work was often tedious, involving endless meetings with stakeholders, revisions of legislative language, and negotiations over provisions that seemed minor but carried major political implications. But gradually, the Research Integrity Protection Act began taking shape as a viable piece of legislation. We'd simplified the original proposal, focusing on 3 core provisions: mandatory documentation of research contributions for federally funded projects, standardized procedures for investigating misconduct allegations, and whistleblower protections for people who reported intellectual property theft. The strategy was to build broad coalitions of support rather than depending on partisan politics. We worked with student organizations who provided grassroots advocacy, legal scholars who offered academic credibility, and even some university administrators who recognized that stronger oversight would protect institutions from liability and reputational damage. 6 months into my congressional role, I received a phone call that brought my work full circle. Marcus Chen was calling from Portland with news about Dylan. "He's trying to make a comeback," Marcus said, his voice tight with frustration. "New business, new website, same fraudulent practices. And he's specifically targeting research integrity advocates, claiming we're part of some conspiracy to destroy innovative entrepreneurs." I sat in my small D.C. office, looking out at the Capitol dome while processing this information. I'd assumed that Dylan's professional destruction had been permanent, that the investigation and media attention had effectively ended his ability to work in consulting or research-related fields. "What kind of comeback?" I asked. "He's launched something called Innovation Defense Consulting. Claims to help entrepreneurs and researchers protect their intellectual property from vindictive competitors and institutional bias. His website has testimonials from people saying the Research Integrity Project ruined their careers through false accusations." Marcus forwarded me screenshots of Dylan's new materials. The website was professionally designed, with stock photos of diverse professionals shaking hands and working collaboratively. Dylan's bio described him as a, quote, "thought leader in intellectual property strategy," who had been, quote, "falsely targeted by activist organizations seeking to stifle entrepreneurial innovation." What was most disturbing was how he'd positioned his previous fraud charges. According to his new narrative, the investigation into his consulting practice had been a coordinated attack by competitors who resented his success. He claimed that family dynamics had been weaponized by people seeking to damage his reputation, and that the Research Integrity Project was part of a larger effort to suppress independent research and consulting. "He's not just denying what he did," I told Marcus. He's trying to turn it into evidence of his victimization. And it's working. We've had 3 clients in the past month who received calls from potential employers saying they'd heard, concerning things, about people associated with research integrity advocacy. Dylan is actively trying to discredit anyone who's worked with us. This development was both predictable and infuriating. Dylan had always been skilled at reframing narratives to position himself as the sympathetic figure, and his new business model was essentially an extension of the same manipulation tactics he'd used our entire lives. But now he was using those tactics to undermine the work we'd done to protect other victims of intellectual property theft. I spent the weekend researching Dylan's new operation more thoroughly. He'd been careful to avoid making specific claims about his previous work that could be easily disproven, but his entire business model was built on undermining legitimate investigations into research misconduct. He was offering services to help people defend against false plagiarism allegations and, quote, rebuild careers damaged by activist campaigns. Most concerning was evidence that he was advising people who had been legitimately accused of intellectual property theft. One testimonial on his website came from someone I recognized, Dr. Raymond Hutchins, the professor whose systematic plagiarism we'd exposed 2 years earlier. Innovation Defense Consulting helped me understand that the allegations against me were part of a coordinated effort to silence independent research. Hutchins had written, Dylan Winters provided the strategic guidance I needed to protect my reputation and continue my important work. I called Representative Gonzalez to discuss this development and its potential impact on our legislation. This is actually helpful, she said, reviewing the materials I'd compiled. It demonstrates exactly why we need federal oversight. When there are no consequences for intellectual property theft, perpetrators just find new ways to continue their exploitation. She was right. Dylan's comeback attempt illustrated the limitations of individual accountability without systemic reform. He'd faced personal and professional consequences for his fraud, but there had been no lasting institutional changes to prevent him from simply rebranding his services and targeting new victims. Over the following months, Dylan's activities became a case study we referenced during congressional hearings and stakeholder meetings. His website provided concrete examples of how intellectual property thieves operated, how they manipulated narratives to discredit their victims, and how they continued exploiting people even after being exposed. But Dylan's renewed presence in my life also created unexpected complications. He began showing up at events where I was speaking, not to confront me directly but to network with attendees and plant seeds of doubt about my credibility and motivations. He'd position himself as a reformed entrepreneur who'd learned from past mistakes, while subtly suggesting that my advocacy work was driven by personal vendetta rather than genuine concern for research integrity. The strategy was sophisticated and partially effective. Some people who might have supported our legislation began questioning whether federal oversight was necessary, or whether the Research Integrity Project represented legitimate advocacy or family drama played out on a public stage. He's trying to make this about you instead of about the policy, observed Dr. Elena Vasquez during one of our regular check-in calls. She'd been following the legislative process from Portland while continuing her work with homeless services. Don't let him shift the focus from systematic problems to personal conflicts. Her advice was sound but difficult to implement. Dylan had always been skilled at making everything about interpersonal dynamics rather than substantial issues, and his new approach was an extension of that same pattern. He was trying to reduce comprehensive policy reform to a sibling disagreement, hoping that congressional attention would move on to other priorities. The breakthrough came during a Senate hearing on research integrity where Dylan had managed to get himself invited as a witness representing, quote, entrepreneurs falsely accused of intellectual property theft. He testified about the dangers of federal overreach and the need to protect innovative businesses from activist harassment. But Senator Patricia Walsh from Massachusetts, who had been following our legislation closely, asked a question that Dylan wasn't prepared to answer. Mr. Winters, she said, can you provide this committee with documentation of the original research that formed the basis of your consulting practice between 2019 and 2022? The question was devastating in its simplicity. Dylan had built his entire professional identity around claiming credit for research he hadn't conducted, and he had no legitimate documentation to support his expertise claims. His testimony had been filled with vague references to key innovative methodologies and proprietary frameworks. But he couldn't provide any evidence that he'd actually developed the work he'd been selling. "Senator, that information is proprietary and commercially sensitive," Dillon responded, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I'm not asking for trade secrets," Senator Walsh continued. "I'm asking for basic evidence that you conducted the research you've claimed credit for. Academic citations, preliminary studies, developmental timelines. The kind of documentation any legitimate researcher would maintain." Dillon's inability to provide satisfactory answers exposed the fundamental weakness in his new business model. He could rebrand himself and manipulate narratives, but he couldn't create a legitimate research record that didn't exist. His testimony, intended to undermine our legislation, instead provided the most compelling evidence for why federal oversight was necessary. The hearing ended with Senator Walsh noting that intellectual property thieves often responded to exposure by attacking the credibility of their victims, rather than addressing their own misconduct. She suggested that Dillon's testimony had inadvertently demonstrated the exact problems our legislation was designed to address. Within 2 months, the Research Integrity Protection Act had passed through committee and was scheduled for floor votes in both houses of Congress. The legislation had gained bipartisan support, driven partly by Dillon's own testimony and the clear pattern of exploitation it had revealed. I was in Representative Gonzalez's office, working on implementation guidelines for the new law, when I received an unexpected visitor. My assistant knocked on the door to announce that Dillon was in the waiting area, asking to speak with me privately. "You don't have to see him," Representative Gonzalez said, looking up from the budget documents she'd been reviewing. "Actually, I think I do." I found Dillon sitting in the reception area, wearing another expensive suit but looking older and more worn than I'd seen him during his Senate testimony. He stood when he saw me, and for the first time in our adult lives, he didn't immediately try to dominate the conversation. "Can we talk somewhere private?" he asked. I led him to a small conference room down the hall. We sat across from each other at a table that had hosted countless policy negotiations, and I waited for him to explain why he'd come. "The bill is going to pass," he said finally. "Yes, it is. My business is finished, not just the current one, but any possibility of working in this field again." I looked at him across the table, this person who'd shaped so much of my life through his manipulations and betrayals, and felt nothing, not anger, not satisfaction, not even curiosity about what he wanted from this conversation. "That's a consequence of your choices," I said. Dillon nodded, rubbing his temples in a gesture that reminded me of our father during difficult conversations. "I know. I'm not here to ask for anything or to try to change what's happening. I just wanted to understand something." "What?" "How you did it. How you went from being the person who never fought back to someone who built all of this." He gestured toward the Capitol building, visible through the conference room window. "How you became someone who wins." The question surprised me because it revealed an assumption I hadn't realized Dillon held, that our relationship had always been a competition with winners and losers. From his perspective, my advocacy work, the Research Integrity Project, the federal legislation, even my congressional role, were all moves in a game he thought we'd been playing our entire lives. "This was never about winning," I said. "It was about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to other people." "But you did win. You destroyed my career, exposed my methods, turned my own testimony against me, and now you're creating laws that will prevent anyone else from doing what I did. That's not just winning, that's total victory." I realized that Dillon still didn't understand the fundamental difference between our motivations. He saw my work as an elaborate revenge plot, a sophisticated way of getting back at him for years of exploitation and dismissal. The idea that I might be genuinely motivated by concern for other victims, or that systemic change might be more important than personal vindication, was incomprehensible to him. "Dillon, 3 years ago you deleted my files and stole my thesis to build your consulting practice. I could have spent that time trying to destroy you personally. Instead, I spent it building something that helps other people protect their work. The fact that your career got destroyed in the process was a side effect, not the goal." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to process this explanation. In his worldview, where relationships were fundamentally transactional and success was measured by dominance over others, The concept of building something larger than personal victory didn't make sense. "I don't believe that," he said finally. "Nobody spends 3 years of their life on something this comprehensive without wanting revenge." "Then you don't understand me at all, which explains why you never saw this coming." Dylan left without another word, and I never saw him again. But I heard about what happened to him through Marcus, who occasionally monitored his activities to ensure he wasn't creating new problems for our clients. Dylan's innovation defense consulting closed within 6 months of the Research Integrity Protection Act becoming law. The federal requirements for documentation and oversight made it impossible for him to operate in the research and consulting space, and his reputation had been so thoroughly damaged that he couldn't find legitimate work in related fields. He moved to Phoenix and took a sales job with a medical equipment company, work that was completely unrelated to research or intellectual property. According to Marcus, he'd largely disappeared from public view, maintaining minimal social media presence and avoiding any activities that might draw attention to his previous fraud. "It's like he finally understood that his old life was permanently over," Marcus told me during one of our quarterly check-ins. "No more attempts at comebacks. No more efforts to discredit our work. He's just gone." The Research Integrity Protection Act was signed into law on a gray March morning 2 years and 8 months after Dylan had deleted my thesis files. I stood in the East Room of the White House, watching President Chen sign legislation that would protect thousands of future researchers from intellectual property theft. The ceremony was attended by student advocates, academic administrators, legal scholars, and several victims of research misconduct who had become advocates themselves. Avery Kim was there, now completing her postdoctoral research and serving on the advisory board of the Research Integrity Project. Dr. Okafor had flown in from Seattle, where she'd established a legal clinic specializing in intellectual property protection for minority researchers. Most meaningfully, Marcus Chen stood beside me as one of the bill's primary architects, having evolved from a victimized graduate student to a national expert on research integrity policy. The organization we'd built together now operated in 12 states and had helped over 800 victims of intellectual property theft. But the moment that struck me most powerfully came when President Chen handed me one of the signing pens and said, "This legislation exists because you refuse to let personal harm become just personal harm. You turned individual injustice into systematic protection." After the ceremony, I walked through the National Mall, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 4 years earlier, I'd been sitting in a tiny efficiency apartment in Portland, printing documentation of Dylan's fraud and wondering whether anyone would believe me. Now I was leaving the White House after watching the president sign legislation I'd helped create. The housing initiative I'd originally developed for my thesis had been implemented in 14 cities and was providing stable accommodation for over 3,000 formerly homeless individuals. The Research Integrity Project had become a permanent fixture in academic policy discussions, consulting with universities nationwide on intellectual property protection procedures. The federal legislation would create oversight mechanisms that could prevent systematic exploitation in research settings. None of this would have happened if Dylan hadn't sabotaged my thesis defense. His attempt to steal my future had inadvertently created a much larger future than I'd ever imagined for myself. I returned to my apartment that evening and found an envelope that had been slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short handwritten note. "You built what no one saw coming. Thank you for proving that justice is possible." The note was unsigned, but I recognized the handwriting. It was from one of our early clients, a doctoral student whose dissertation had been stolen by her advisor 3 years earlier. We'd helped her prove the theft, expose the advisor's misconduct, and ultimately complete her degree at a different institution. She was now a professor herself, working on research that would improve educational opportunities for first-generation college students. I kept the note on my desk, next to a framed copy of the Research Integrity Protection Act and a photograph from the White House signing ceremony. They represented different aspects of the same principle: that individual harm could be transformed into systematic protection, that personal betrayal could become the foundation for institutional change, and that the people who tried to erase you often ended up highlighting exactly why your work matters. 6 months later, I received a final communication from Dylan. Not a phone call or a visit, but an email sent to my congressional address with the subject line, "Acknowledgement." The message was brief. "Zara, I understand now that what I did to you was wrong. Not just strategically stupid, but genuinely wrong. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for reconciliation. I just wanted you to know that I see what you built, and I recognize that it's something I never could have created. You were always better than me at building things that mattered. I read the email twice, then deleted it. Not out of anger, but because it was irrelevant to the work I was doing and the life I'd built. Dylan's acknowledgement of his wrongdoing was decades late and entirely unnecessary for my sense of closure or satisfaction. What mattered was that the Research Integrity Protection Act was being implemented effectively, with universities across the country establishing new procedures for documenting research contributions and investigating misconduct allegations. What mattered was that the Research Integrity Project continued expanding its services and helping victims of intellectual property theft. What mattered was that systematic change was protecting people who would never know their names or understand how close they'd come to being exploited. I'd learned that the most powerful response to betrayal isn't revenge, but building something that prevents other people from experiencing the same harm. Dylan had tried to erase my work and claim my future. Instead, he'd motivated me to create a future that was larger, more impactful, and more meaningful than anything I'd originally envisioned. The morning Dylan deleted my files, I thought my academic career was over, and my 2 years of research had been wasted. I was wrong on both counts. My academic career had just begun, and my research had become the foundation for legislation that would protect thousands of future researchers from intellectual property theft. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you exactly the motivation you need to build something unstoppable. Dylan thought he was stealing my presentation. Actually, he was creating the conditions for me to present my ideas to Congress and turn them into federal law. He never expected that destroying my thesis defense would lead to me defending research integrity at the highest levels of government. But then again, Dylan never was good at seeing the bigger picture. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.